Whether it is to cure a simple headache, aid recovery after surgery, or treat serious diseases such as cancer, drugs are part of our daily lives. It is not surprising that the evolution of medicine and drugs is one of the main factors that have contributed to increasing life expectancy from just over 30 years in 1900 to over 70 years in the last decade, and in some countries it can exceed 80 years. Drugs vary widely, and so do their prices, from a few cents for a pill to millions of dollars, such as Zolgensma, developed by the Swiss laboratory Novartis, which costs around 1 million euros. With the power to save lives or improve the well-being of millions of people, the pharmaceutical industry has naturally become vital to humanity. However, all this power has been concentrated in the hands of a few companies and their managers, more concerned with profits than with saving lives. Many act like true mafiosi, using the worst possible practices to increase the profits and power of their organizations. How do these companies operate? What tactics do they use that resemble those practiced by the mafia? That is what we are going to expand our global knowledge on in today's video, starting with the emergence of this gigantic market and how pharmaceutical companies gained so much power. Although the pharmaceutical sector is currently one of the most modern and technologically advanced in the world, the production of medicines is a very old activity that has its origins as far back as the Middle Ages. It goes without saying that at that time the sector was limited to small apothecaries, who created remedies from elements of nature and based solely on popular knowledge. The foundations of the pharmaceutical industry as we know it today were laid in 1668 with the founding of the Merck Pharmacy in Darmstadt in Germany. Almost 400 years later, the company is still in existence and is one of the largest in the industry, as is Pfizer, founded in 1849, Roche in 1896, and several other century-old companies that dominate the industry. The first revolution in the industry took place around 1900, when Bayer launched acetylsalicylic acid, which became known as aspirin and changed the way the world treated pain. In the following decades, new important discoveries were made, such as insulin and the most revolutionary of all up to that time, penicillin. With the new drug discovered by Alexander Fleming in 1928, mankind was able to treat infections such as pneumonia and infectious diseases caused by wounds for the first time. The drug was used on a large scale in World War II to treat wounded soldiers and demonstrated the importance of research and development of new drugs, and gave the pharmaceutical industry a hitherto unimaginable power. In the second half of the last century, public healthcare systems such as the British NHS began to be set up in several countries, and more people had access to healthcare treatment. The rise of the consumer market and advances in the understanding of biology and chemistry led to a period that became known as the Golden Age of drug development. This phase, which lasted until the 1970s, saw the emergence of birth control pills, new antibiotics, some antidepressants, the first cancer treatments, and even the popular paracetamol and ibuprofen. The drug market was growing every year, as was the professionalization of the sector. Laboratories that used to manufacture products as diverse as hair gel, toothpaste, and medicines increasingly turned to the production of new drugs, and large companies consolidated their positions in the sector. Through mergers or acquisitions, large corporations emerged, and some dilemmas began to emerge. According to the New York Times, in 1950 the pharmaceutical industry became the most profitable in the United States and exposed a dilemma between two different ways of looking at the sector. On the one hand, there were those who believed that profits should not be the primary objective in this business. Among them was Merck's CEO, George Merck, who declared that companies should never forget that medicine is for people and not for profit, and that if they did not forget this, profits would come and they would get bigger and bigger. On the other hand, there was the opinion of people like John McKean, president of Pfizer, who declared that it made no sense to invest in drugs that did not generate substantial revenues. In this dispute, it seems that the purely commercial view of the business triumphed, and the greed of executives and the quest for ever-increasing profits made many pharmaceutical companies look more like mafia organizations. How do they operate? With all that is known about mafia organizations, it is no secret that extortion is one of the most important sources of income for these groups. Also for some pharmaceutical companies. But in this case, there is little concern about hiding the dirty business. Perhaps the biggest example of this, but not the only one, occurred in 2015, when Turing Pharmaceuticals raised the price of Daraprim overnight from $13.50 to $750. The company, led at the time by Martin Shkreli, bought the rights to the drug, which had been on the market for 62 years. After reaching some agreements with suppliers and other strategies that prevented competitors from producing the same drug, it obtained exclusivity for the product and used it to engage in outright extortion against patients in need of the drug, which was used to treat pregnant women and AIDS patients, among other cases. Far from being the isolated behavior of a greedy entrepreneur, the practice is common in the market. The Gilead Laboratory, for example, launched a drug to treat hepatitis C in 2013. The drug, called Sovaldi, went on the market with a price tag of $84,000 for a treatment of just 12 weeks. Normally, pharmaceutical companies claim that the high costs of the drug are due to the amounts invested in research for its development. But according to a report in the Washington Post, a U.S. Senate investigation found that the company determined the price of the drug taking into account the profit they could make from sales. According to the article, the executives worked with a price range of $50,000 to $115,000 and chose 84 simply because if they charged $50,000, they would lose a lot of revenue, and if they charged the maximum, the company would have reputational problems. In fact, it must be said that the companies set the price and do not force anyone to buy. It can even be said that everything is done legally, but it must also be said that it is difficult to define what legality is when these companies resort to corruption, another typical resource of the mafias, and thus manage to even determine what is or is not legal. Corruption is deeply rooted in the pharmaceutical industry and occurs at many levels and in many different ways. At what can be considered the lowest level, companies corrupt doctors to prescribe their drugs. A landmark case was uncovered in Italy in 2004, when investigations revealed that 4,400 doctors were receiving kickbacks from the British laboratory GlaxoSmithKline, now known simply as GSK. Authorities alleged that the company's salesmen paid for trips, luxury watches, and even cash to get doctors to prescribe the lab's drugs. At higher levels, there is also corruption. Many laboratories pay large sums for renowned professionals to sign or produce studies highlighting the positive aspects of their products without mentioning the side effects. A report in the New York Times in 2008 shows that several laboratories paid more than $1.5 million to Dr. Joseph Biederman. The doctor was one of the foremost authorities on child psychiatry, and thanks to him, millions of children have been diagnosed with attention deficit disorder. The other part of the story is that the prescription of drugs for these little patients skyrocketed, and one of the most prescribed drugs was manufactured by companies like Johnson & Johnson, which was on the list of companies that paid the doctor. Outside of medical circles, corruption is also widespread and reaches the highest echelons of power, often disguised as legal action. Suspicions of corruption also abound in the regulatory agencies in charge of approving drugs. With all the power and money that these companies have, they are closely linked to the governments of several countries around the world. In the United States alone, where lobbying is legalized, the pharmaceutical industry has some 1,800 highly paid lobbyists just to work in the federal Congress. The figure is so absurd that it exceeds the number of congressmen by more than 3 times. And these lobbyists include prominent figures from both the Republican and Democratic parties. All this without going into the subject of campaign donations, so as not to go into too much detail and to be able to cover other points in which big business acts like the mafia. This is the case of illegal drug distribution. Normally, this role is reserved exclusively for the mafias and cartels that operate in the criminal underworld. But an investigation published by the Los Angeles Times reveals that Purdue Pharm acted in much the same way, favoring the illegal trade of its main drug. The investigation reveals that the company learned that a Los Angeles clinic was prescribing OxyContin indiscriminately and took no action. According to the investigation, the Lake Medical Clinic was responsible for prescribing in 1 week the amount it would take a pharmacy at least a month to sell. Faced with the unusual volume, a sales manager went to the site and noted the illegal sale of drugs, but the company, in addition to failing to notify the appropriate authorities, continued to sell its drugs. The report indicates that this was not an isolated case, and that for more than a decade the company had gathered evidence indicating illegal trafficking of its drugs and had done nothing to stop it. And it appears that Purdue Pharma was not alone in this endeavor, as a report by The Guardian shows a consortium of several companies, including Johnson & Johnson and major drug distributors. This consortium mapped the regions that consumed the most opioids and acted to increase shipments to these locations, even when there were already several indications that the situation was out of control and that the drug was devastating parts of the United States. Several parallels can still be drawn between pharmaceutical companies and mafias, including territorial disputes. Obviously, we are not talking about blood feuds over control of neighborhoods or regions. In the case of Big Pharma, the territory is called a patent. Starting in the 1990s, companies realized that their intellectual property was worth much more than their factories, distribution networks, and stocks. Patents guarantee a pharmaceutical company the right to market a drug without any competitor for a minimum period of 20 years, charging as much as it wants. However, companies often find ways to circumvent the laws and maintain their monopoly for a while longer. One of the techniques used to do this is to introduce small changes in the formula of drugs after they are launched. By doing so, pharmaceutical companies manage to register new patents, which often number in the hundreds, and when the first one expires, a huge amount remains, preventing other laboratories from launching cheaper versions. And when this tactic does not work, the big players in the industry move on to another, more aggressive strategy. According to the U.S. Federal Trade Commission, some companies resort to a practice known as pay for delay. In these cases, large pharmaceutical companies pay huge sums of money to smaller laboratories so that they do not launch generic versions of their drugs. In this way, they still have a monopoly and can charge as much as they want for their drugs. And in the constant search for higher profits, the activities of pharmaceutical companies have no borders and no limits. In 1996, Nigeria was suffering from an epidemic of cholera, meningitis, and other diseases. Pfizer, the largest company in the industry, decided to take advantage of the situation to test a new drug. 200 hospitalized children underwent a study in which half were given the U.S. pharmaceutical company's drug, Trovan, and the other 100 were given the usual drug used in these cases, the antibiotic ceftriaxone. The results presented showed that the new drug was more effective, as there were 5 deaths among the patients who received Trovan compared to 6 in the other group. However, after several complaints, investigations were carried out, and it was discovered that the company had manipulated the dosage of the reference group, reducing the amount so that their drug would work better. In addition, according to several reports, the company failed to inform the children's families that it was an untested drug with as yet unknown side effects. Among the children who survived, several were left with irreversible sequelae, some with liver disease and others with some form of disability. After several years of legal disputes, Pfizer was ordered in 2009 to pay $75 million in damages. In this video, we have only mentioned a few cases and companies, but the research conducted shows that questionable practices are commonplace in an industry whose main mission should be to save lives. There are many other situations that could be included, and we could certainly make a video at least twice as long as this one. As we here at Global Knowledge always try to keep videos within standards, we have had to leave a lot of material out. But if you think this topic is relevant, and that all the rot in the industry deserves to be shown, please leave a comment and share this video. If our audience is interested, we will make a video with many more cases. If you liked the video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to receive more amazing content. Thanks to all of you who joined us, and see you next time.